Hello, everyone, and thank you, Hattie, for that introduction and for this invite. My talk today is on centering identity, culture, and relationship in psychedelic sessions. This talk is rooted in my experience as a Black American psychedelic researcher. I'm going to take you through a little of my story. Well, I'll share about my experience as a participant in a healthy volunteer trial for MDMA therapy and how this experience shaped my understanding around navigating culture, race, identity in psychedelic sessions. Now, I'm going to mention some experiences of stress from racism. I'm also going to talk a bit about racial identity. So please do check in with yourselves and resource as you need. To position myself in this conversation, I am a cis Black woman from the country, from a small town in the upper Southeast United States, from a land that was stolen from the Cherokee people, from a place that's now known as Kentucky. I am the daughter of Gerald and Joyce Reed, the granddaughter of James and Sara Reed, and Loman and Sarah Owen. I'm also a partner, a mama to some fish and some plants, and particularly for this conversation, I am a mental health futurist, which for me means I actively reimagine what mental wellness can look like in this era of digital technology and body technology, music technology, sound technology, and plant technology, which is where psychedelic sessions come in. There are many teachers who inform how I practice and approach this work. Now, just to name a few, I'll start with Desiree Fontenot, whose work on queer ecology really reminded me about how we live in a world full of diverse forms of embodiment, sex and gender variations, kinship, care systems, and strategies for living and reproducing. Kylie Taylor is also another teacher whose work on inner ethics reminds me to continuously do my own work and really examine what it means to be in right relationship with each participant or each client that I see. And MDMA is also a teacher that is quite relevant for this presentation. And this is really where my research journey starts. In 2017, I attended my first training sponsored by MAPS. And pictured here is the Yukon Original Therapist team with me on the left, then Mickey Kazicki next to me, Monica Williams in the middle, Terrence Ching to her left, and Jamila George at the end. And this training was for the clinical study of MDMA therapy for PTSD. And our particular study team was focused on providing participants with a culturally informed therapeutic experience. And as part of the MAPS therapist training, I got to participate in an optional study where I took MDMA in a one-time clinical setting. Now, I wasn't just offered MDMA and then sent home, that I got to experience a week-long study that was similar to what participants in the clinical trial got. So I had to go through a screening process, a preparation. There were 2 dosing sessions, one with MDMA, one with placebo, and integration and follow-up. Now, I was someone who had taken psychedelics and other drugs before, so I knew what it meant to expand my consciousness. I was familiar with that, and I knew the guides that I would be working with. So I was maybe even a little too comfortable going into the experience, but it was important for me to go through this healthy volunteer trial because I wanted to experience firsthand what I would be asking participants who would be going through the trial. I wanted to know what they would be going through. And I also didn't want to know about MDMA therapy from solely a lecture-based way. I really wanted to know about the therapy in a more embodied way. And I don't have time to go into the full story of what happened in my dosing session, but I did want to highlight a few themes that are relevant to our conversation today. And so to paint the picture, I arrived to the site. I was feeling pretty open, curious, and I got administered the MDMA. I'm lying on the couch, very comfy couch, with two therapists by my side. And I am just anticipating the moments when the ordinary becomes the non-ordinary. And the way that I track that is by moving my eye shades up and just watching the clock. But after about maybe 45 minutes, I started to notice sensations in my body that my body was becoming more alive and I was feeling more connected with myself. And so I'm just mindfully observing this process, and I could really feel the music really connecting with me, mind, body, and spirit. And shortly after that, the music carried me away, and one of my grandmothers appeared. And this grandmother was a grandmother who had passed away some years prior. And being with her presence again was very comforting, reassuring, very warm. And she reminded me that she's still with me. And her presence also helped me to disarm her, to really undo these concepts that I had about myself, who I was as a therapist in the study, and to really unmask as this was a necessary part of my journey. And she carried me to a place that I always knew existed, but had never seen. And this was a place that felt so familiar, but so distant. And the only way I know how to describe it is I felt like I had traveled to the essence of the universe, to really a space of divinity. And I finally had a place where I belong. And not too long after this communion with my grandmother in this expansive space of belonging, my experience shifted and it felt like my body started to slow me down, that my breath got slower, my body felt heavier. And it was during this wave of my experience where I came back into my body and inhabited the stories of my past and ancestral past. And even during the experience, I was thinking that there must be some technique that the therapist could provide for me as I'm riding this wave of my experience. But little did I know that coming back into my body and coming back into these stories was a huge part of my experience. The racism, the violence, the terror. And the terror that I had been disconnected from my entire adult life. Because, see, as a Black woman socialized in America, I've had to learn how to survive and to keep myself safe. And so, with these defenses no longer present, I'm really raw, open, and unfiltered. And it was quite a destabilizing experience for me. And my therapist did the best that they could in helping me move through this experience. But I was left feeling misunderstood. And I was left questioning this really stark difference between this personal or human reality that I experienced in this expansive state with my grandmother, where I felt like I belonged, and also this political reality of what it meant to come back to my body and the stories that are with it. And this is where we talk a little bit about identity. So, just as there's great diversity in nature and other living systems, there too is much diversity in our humanity. There's diversity in how we embody, experience, perceive, and navigate the world. There's also much nuance and diversity in the way the world navigates around each of us. Racial identity is one marker that impacts the way people, particularly in the Western world, navigate around each other. It's an identity that can be felt differently depending on the group that you're in. When it comes to navigating the world, many authors like W.E.B. Du Bois and Toni Morrison talk about this two-ness that Black folks experience in their racial identity. This two-ness in identity being that, yes, I am human and conscious and having a human experience, and I'm Black. And what does it mean to be Black? That even as someone who has recently moved to London, I'm noticing that my experience as a Black woman in London is vastly different than my experience as a Black woman in the Southeast United States. James Baldwin in The Fire Next Time writes that color is not a personal or human reality, it's a political one. And I find that this two-ness, this both and the personal and the political, can manifest in psychedelic sessions, regardless of the racial or ethnic backgrounds of the guides. And knowing what to do, or at minimum giving space for both to coexist, can be humanizing and regulatory for someone in an expanded state of consciousness. That being seen and validated in these diverse parts of your identity can be an important part of the medicine. Now, there are many ways to practice and center a person's identity and cultural background in session, but we can't talk about identity and culture without talking about the impact that colonization and white supremacy culture has on how we understand and experience ourselves and the barriers that these legacies create. Now, I don't have time to talk about the nuanced ways that colonization or white supremacy culture can show up in our psyches or in our behaviors, but I do want to mention a few things that I've noticed in the clinical research space that are rooted in these ideologies. Now, when I talk about white supremacy culture, I'm talking about the unquestioning adoption of belief systems, practices that center white, often economically privileged people, and devalues, erases, and in some clinical cases, pathologizes the experiences and beliefs and practices of people of color. Now, while some of these practices may be conscious, a lot of these practices are unconscious. And this isn't an exhaustive list of the ways that white supremacy culture can manifest in sessions, but these are a few that I did want to highlight. And the concepts presented on this slide come from a book called The Dismantling Racism book by Kenneth Jones and Tima Okun. So the erasure of indigenous fluence is one way, particularly manifesting as in psychedelic therapy training programs, indigenous influence will be considered something that's historical or not current. Also, even in talking about and using the word psychedelics, that's a colonist practice because medicine work was renamed. Cultural sensitivity as a special topic is another element that comes up. That cultural sensitivity is not something that is actually part of good clinical practice, but it's optional. It's something that you do if clinicians or guides feel like it. There's an over reliance on verbal processing, and particularly in the ways that people experience a dosing session. So, for example, having eye shades and music on, lying still for hours can be really useful and helpful for some folks, but for others, that could be quite overstimulating. There's also a sense of urgency that can come up particularly a sense of urgency in treatment, a sense of urgency in research design. If you have more questions about that, definitely ask me in the Q&A. And sense of urgency, I acknowledge, can also be rooted in capitalism. And there's a superiority complex that I see manifest, particularly in the medicalization of psychedelics, with some folks saying that psychedelics, it's only safe to take psychedelics in a medical context, and that's just not true. Thanks. So, in thinking about cultural sensitivity, there are many models of care that one can adopt or one can practice through to be culturally sensitive. And I would like to talk a little bit about of how I practice and what I mean when I say culturally responsible care. And I want to highlight that I'm saying culturally responsible care and not culturally competent care, because I truly don't believe that anybody can be competent in a culture. That I do believe it's our responsibility as guides to really be sensitive to the ways that a person's biology or past health history, a person's psychology, or the way they perceive the world, their cultural and social identities, how they navigate in the world, and their environment, that all of these factors influence how someone shows up. And all of these factors influence how someone can even access treatment. And to maybe define culturally responsible care, I define it as an attunement to the way a person embodies, expresses, and experiences health and illness. Now, this definition is a definition in working progress, but it's a definition that's inspired by the work by Risma Minikim, Camille Barton, and Kim Indefo, Dr. Carmen Knudsen Martin, and Dr. Kenneth Hardy. And centering culture is about recognizing the ways that someone culturally expresses their pain or symptoms, and how the way that they express their symptoms may not be the same with another person. So, for example, sometimes the more stigmatized mental health is within a particular social group, the less likely this person is going to use pathologizing ways to talk about their mental health. Say a Black man who lives in America, who's in his 60s or 70s, who grew up in the South, who grew up in an era where men had to be strong. He's probably not going to use the word anxious to describe any anxiety that he experiences. He's probably going to use words like stress. So, as I close my talk with relationship and what it means to center relationship in psychedelic sessions, I acknowledge that centering relationship includes your own relationship with the substance that you're working with, the expectations that you have about that substance, and of course, how that influences the journey. Of course, relationship includes the relationship that you have with the people that you're working with. But we also can't forget about the relationship we have with our own humanity and with our own pain. So, really questioning what's the work I need to do as a therapist or facilitator so that I can show up and hold space for another person without having my own biases, my own trauma interfere or harm the person that I'm working with. When my own triggers come up in sessions, not if they come up, but when they come up, how do I respond? How can I regulate myself so that my own triggers aren't impacting the therapeutic container? That what's my own comfort with talking about race, sexual orientation, gender identity? What do I notice in my body and in my thoughts when I am called to have these discussions, that I've learned that it doesn't matter if a therapist has the best techniques of what it means to be culturally sensitive or uses culturally sensitive assessment tools, that these are all great and are part of the process. But if someone hasn't examined their own relationship to these topics, the delivery of the intervention is not going to land as one might expect. So as I close, creating equitable futures in psychedelic therapy and research must prioritize the needs of those most oppressed and impacted by the medicalization of psychedelics. And this includes a variety of different demographics of folks. We need to revisit our research methods and designs and ensure that they are culturally sensitive. Before we talk about diversity recruitment, let's take a look at the protocol and make sure that the people who created the protocols are just as diverse as the people we want to enroll. And it's been mentioned several times in this conference that we need to acknowledge diverse models of care. That, yes, the medical model is a way to have folks gain access to psychedelics, but it's not the only way. That healing can happen in recreational containers. Healing can happen in self-administered containers. Healing can happen in communities, in retreat settings. And if we really want to talk about accessibility, we need to really be inclusive of all of these different models of care. So maybe one more last bit to mention, that I've heard a few presenters talk about, we need more diversity, we need more inclusion, and that's really great. However, what are we doing with it? Like, it's one thing to just talk about it, but it's actually another thing to do something about it. So my call to action is that we all do our part in trying to make the space more diverse and inclusive. And I look forward to your questions and your comments at the end. Thank you.